Okay, we're taking up right where we left off with the Boston Tea Party. Sometimes I remember to mention stuff like that, and sometimes I just have to put it on the screen. But this is the famous Boston Tea Party, and it was an act of resistance. It destroyed something like 10,000 pounds sterling worth of tea. This is an enormous, enormous fortune's worth of tea. Now, the impact that it had in Britain was huge. There was unprecedented demand politically for cracking down on the colonies, taking charge, that sort of thing, punitive measures, and some were forthcoming. But a lot of people had a lot riding on the East India Company's survival, and this incident marked the colony's final rejection of that. Now, as it turned out, East India did recover. It went on its greater days. We're still ahead of it. But nobody knew that at the time. But it initiates what I call an action-reaction syndrome. I meant to explain about that back in the earlier in the background. Before let's see, I don't remember where that was exactly supposed to go, but it should sound familiar because it doesn't take two countries to play a game like this. Let's say the British government does something that they think is reasonable and necessary, and they're trying to soften the blow. And colonists read into it something sinister, and they react to the British action, showing some resistance. The British feel that makes them feel like they need to just, crack down, make sure that we know who's boss and it's not us. So they overreact to our reaction, which confirms our worst fears. They're coming after us. We better get ready. So we overreact to their overreaction, whereupon they overreact to our overreaction, and you end up with no middle ground left to stand on. So this had started up and died down a couple of times already with the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties. This time, it's going to go the distance. So, in response to huge public demand, in the spring of 1774, the English Parliament passed a number of punitive laws aimed at the city of Boston and the whole colony of Massachusetts. They're in the supplement, so I'll not take a lot of time with any one of them, but here's what there are three of them. And they're known collectively as the coercive acts. To coerce someone means to force them to do something they do not want to do or would not freely choose to do. Okay, but they're punitive. First, I don't know which order they came in. I'll take them in the order in which they come to mind. You have the Massachusetts Government Act, which altered the charter of the colony, which had been written up by Parliament to begin with. It took power away from the elected assembly and gave more power to the governor, giving him something bordering on dictatorial power. Massachusetts Government Act. Then you have the Administration of Justice Act, which provided that any British official or soldier who was accused of a crime in Massachusetts would not be tried before a Massachusetts jury. They're pretty sure they wouldn't get a conviction. They would be tried in England itself before a sympathetic judge and jury. And I remember not telling you about this before. No prosecution witnesses, because to testify, you'd have to drop your own affairs, sail to England, live there for several months, and sail back home again, all at your own expense. It ain't going to happen. Now, this could have been almost like a license to kill. A British soldier kills somebody, what ultimately is going to happen to him? He gets to go home and see his girlfriend, maybe. British authority is going to crumble in just a little over a year after this came down. 2 years tops. And there is the Boston Port Act. Boston's a seaport. Its economic reason for existence is shipping. Ships come, ships go. The Boston Port Act closed the seaport down. No more ships could enter the port. No more ships could clear the port or leave until the entire shipment of tea had been paid for to the last penny, including the tax, out of the general revenue of Massachusetts. Well, that ain't gonna happen. But it inflicted instant depression on Massachusetts, and particularly the city of Boston. Now, there were two more that were unrelated directly to the coercive acts, which also fit into a somewhat larger set, which has the three coercive acts plus two more to make up the intolerable acts, acts of Parliament that we could not tolerate. One of them was an update to a law that had been on the books since the 1690s and applied in England as well. It was called the Quartering Act. So if you're thinking hanged, drawn, and quartered, nope, that's not what this is about. If a soldier is ordered to return to his quarters, that means go back to where it is you bunked down. So, and there'd been an update in this law back in 1765. Here comes another one. The one in 1765 had set it up where the British Army could, if it chose to do so, require colonies to construct quarters to house British troops, barracks, in other words, at their own expense. That brought a sharp rebuke from John Dickinson in one of his letters. This one takes it further. This one says, and of course, I'll tell you what the rumor mill turned it into. The British Army in Boston was authorized to commandeer vacant buildings and use them as barracks, living quarters for their soldiers. Okay, where that went is people believing, and this might have been true, I don't see it in the act itself, they could require you to have a British soldier or two living with you in your own private residence. They may not be congenial guests. You're expected to provide them with a place to sleep. You've got to feed them, polish their boots, stay out of their way, put up with whatever they dish out, and hope they didn't molest your daughter or you. So that was very frightening. I don't know for sure that it happened, but you have the Quartering Act that's intolerable. Next, the Quebec Act. Now, Quebec is the part of southeastern Canada where the descendants of French settlers lived. They still spoke French there. They still speak French there today. And this defined the boundaries of Quebec. Before I tell you about that, when Britain first acquired that area with all these French-speaking people, they attempted to govern them the way an English colony would be governed. They set up an elected assembly. They substituted the English legal system, which has jury trials, for the French legal system, which did not. And they were a bit, I don't know what they did to militate against it, but they were less than tolerant of these people's Catholicism. Well, that had not set well, so what the British are doing in 1774 is basically cleaning that up. They restored the type of government the Frenchmen were used to, which was centralized and authoritarian, and they restored the French legal system, which had never involved jury trials, and they stopped whatever it was they were doing to inhibit the Catholic Church. So far, so good. If they hadn't done that, there's some likelihood the French would have joined us in our revolutionary uprising only a few years later, the next year. But there's one other thing that clearly makes it intolerable. They defined the boundaries of Quebec. You may know where the state of Pennsylvania is located, and the boundary of Pennsylvania drops from Lake Erie down to the Ohio River. The Quebec Act originally drew that boundary and opened up this whole area of the northern coast of the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi Valley to settlement by the French. That was defined as part of Quebec. And people were just flabbergasted. We fought this big war and we won big. And that means we get the Ohio Valley. And the British turn around and give it to them anyway, not to France, but to the French subjects. Now, it's part of the empire. You can still live out there if you want to, but any legal business is going to be in an unfamiliar law code and an unfamiliar language, and you're not going to be represented in an assembly, and you're not going to have access to jury trial, and who knows what else. So this has ruffled a lot of feathers real seriously. The intolerable acts containing the three coercive acts. By this time, everybody's out of metaphorical bullets. We don't know what to do. They don't know what to do. There's just no success at all, even getting us to pay small taxes. We're getting more rebellious all the time. For our part, most colonists deeply yearned to stay in the empire. They loved the advantages that we gained from that, which most people felt outweighed the disadvantages, of which there were some. But we can't go on if the British government keeps acting like this. So it's terminal frustration. Somebody got the idea that maybe if we get all our smartest men and stick them in a room, they can pool their brains and figure out some way to make this work better. Consequently, through the committees of correspondence, the states were called upon to send delegates to a meeting, a Continental Congress, to meet in Philadelphia, which was centrally located, had good accommodations, and no British soldiers, in the fall of 1774, with a view toward trying to work out our differences with Britain. Okay? So this is called the First Continental Congress because there was a second one later that lasted a lot longer. It lasted about 6 weeks, about the second week of September through about the third week of October in 1774. Of the three main viewpoints in the colonies, only two were seriously represented. The main viewpoint would be people that we would call moderates. They find British policies unacceptable, but leaving the empire strikes them as unthinkable. They're not ready to think about that yet. Beyond them, you have a handful of, I'm going to use the word radical, even though it has negative connotations. These are colonists who are already prepared to consider leaving the empire. There aren't many of them. We got John and Samuel Adams and John Hancock from Massachusetts. You got Patrick Henry from Virginia, a few others. It is way too early to talk about that kind of thing out loud. The closest thing you had to a conservative who would have opposed independence was a Pennsylvanian named Joseph Galloway. And Galloway was never on board with independence, but if there were very many more of his viewpoint, I don't know who they would have been. They really didn't come up with much. They kicked some ideas around. Somebody brought back up what was known as the Albany Plan, which had been floated 20 years earlier at the beginning of the French and Indian War by Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Hutchinson at a Congress that took place at Albany, New York. That's where they would set up a system pretty much like what Canada has had for 150 years now. The colonies would be essentially self-governing. There would be a sort of permanent intercolonial Congress or Parliament that they'd send delegations to at a regular basis, presided over by a governor general appointed by the king. It would have some limited taxing authority, that kind of thing. Nobody bought it. Nobody went for it. So you have that. It became evident that the colonists had moved some distance since the Stamp Act protest 9 years earlier. At the time of the Stamp Act protest, we were fully prepared to concede that the British government could use taxation to regulate trade within the empire. But this time, no. This time, most of these delegates would take the position that Britain had no authority to legislate over the colonies in any way at all. You could diagram it. The way the British saw it, you've got the king, he's the king of Great Britain, the government of Great Britain is the government of the empire. That wasn't really of long standing or traditional. Our view increasingly was kind of what had been, nobody diagrammed it this way, but you got the king, he's the king of Great Britain, he's the king of Pennsylvania, he's the king of New York, he's the king of Virginia, he's the king of South Carolina, and they're all on the same level. And the government of Britain is the government of Britain. It is not the government of us. So you have that. Okay, as I'm running out of time, I'll put the more significant things they did into the next one of these. Stay tuned.